bringing you a steady stream of thought-provoking ideas and cutting-edge innovation. You're listening to Society and the State, Life, Liberty, and Your Pursuit of Happiness. Now, your hosts, Connor Boyack and Brian Hyde.
Welcome, everybody, to episode 118. Connor here alongside Brian to talk about the criminal justice system. And while many of us are longtime reformers or would-be reformers of the system, we've had concerns and we're trying to change them. We have an interesting guest today that I'm really excited to talk about. Brett Tolman is a former U.S. attorney, one of the top prosecutors in the country. He was stationed actually here in Utah where we work, and was the U.S. attorney for a while and now has become somewhat of a criminal justice reformer himself. So excited to kind of unpack what's going on there and see what Brett's thoughts are. Brett, thank you very much for joining us.
Great to be with you.
Let me maybe kind of take a step back, Brett. So you went to law school, and at the time were you kind of you had your eye on becoming a prosecutor, or what led you kind of to choose that career path that resulted in being a federal prosecutor?
You know, I knew I wanted to be a prosecutor. I came from a family, a father that was in law enforcement in California. Pretty law and order, conservative family. I think I developed the interest mostly from our family experiencing crime, and we had when I was about 12 years old, my sister, who was at college, was kidnapped, raped, and it was, as you can imagine, incredibly traumatic for her family. So I knew at a young age that, you know, my thoughts about going to school were I wanted to be a prosecutor, put bad guys in jail. That's what I thought was sort of my calling.
Mm. And so you presumably, were you a prosecutor at kind of a local level, or what was kind of your career path that led you to being a U.S. attorney?
You know, I anticipated that I would be maybe a county prosecutor or work in a state AG's office. I always assumed that becoming a federal prosecutor was very, very difficult. It turns out that I just kind of got lucky and met people that took an interest in my career. And so, you know, I worked for a federal judge, and that judge said that I should work in the U.S. Attorney's Office, thought that would be a good fit for me, and he worked hard and helped me get in there.
So what kind of cases did you work on as a U.S. attorney? How long were you there, and what kind of, like, were there any big cases, and let's kind of unpack your work there a little bit before now talking about your slightly different point of view. Yeah.
You know, I started out incredibly aggressive. I was very close to several FBI agents and ATF, and I did violent crime, drug crime, human trafficking, and sex crimes were still not gaining a lot of traction yet, and the focus hadn't turned. But later in my career, I would turn attention to those types of crimes. And then the moment where I felt like I really had done some good was when I pulled the Elizabeth Smart kidnapping case out of the state where it had been languishing for 3 years, brought it into the federal courts, and we prosecuted the kidnappers of Elizabeth Smart. And, you know, I was fortunate enough to work on that case, and very proud of that work. It was very fulfilling given what happened to my sister.
Yeah, I would imagine, just because of that connection. Do you feel that, you know, where your kind of changed view, it sounds like, came a little later, do you feel like because you were in the system, you were kind of prevented from having different views? I recall the quote, I don't remember who said it, about, Brian, you may know this, they cannot see who are paid not to see. Right, there's some
Upton Sinclair.
Is that Upton Sinclair? Yeah. There's this concept where, you know, Brett, to use you an example, you're in the system, and basically you're surrounded by people and a system and a culture that reinforces that point of view. Do you feel that there was merit to that in your own personal experience?
Yes, I will say I'm a big proponent of that exposing that issue, and I've observed it firsthand. The seeds of my, dedication to criminal justice reform, and ultimately in my deciding that the system was broken, those seeds were planted while I was a federal prosecutor. I remember a case in which, there were three basic issues that arose, or cases that kind of planted those reform seeds. One was an individual that I was 100% certain was guilty, and I indicted him, took him in front of took the case in front of the grand jury, indicted him. He was facing real long prison sentence. He asked to meet with me, which was very unusual. Prosecutors, it's almost like they're surgeons. You never really interact with the target of your investigation or the prosecution of the defendant until you're in court, and even then, you have very little, experience with the other side. It's just simply go into court and prove your case. Well, he wanted to meet with me, and it was very unusual for someone to request it. So I go. Me and an FBI agent finally agreed to it, and we sat for a couple of hours while he confessed and closed several open investigations that the state had been investigating. He confessed to multiple robberies. And but then he said something at the end that haunted me, and he said, "But I did not commit this robbery." It was a federal case because of some circumstances with the violence of the robbery. The FBI, I said to the FBI agent, "Does that concern you?" And he said, "No, he's just trying to get out of this case." And I said, "The guy that confesses to dozens and dozens of cases, putting himself at risk, says he didn't do it." And so I asked the FBI agent to investigate it. And 6 months later, we were 100% convinced that he did not do it, that we had indicted the wrong man.
Wow.
And so I had that experience, and then I had one in which a defense attorney revealed to me some issues and problems in the case and with the agents investigating it. And that was an eye-opening experience. I was a young prosecutor. And then the final thing that sort of put me on the track to eventually become a reformer was a case in which the penalty was so severe, and I had no ability to effectively, put the case in front of a judge without jeopardizing the entire life of a young man who really just had a bad weekend, committed a couple of crimes, but because of the circumstances, the sentence he was facing was going to be a life sentence, basically. No one got hurt. It was eye-opening that the criminal justice system would put somebody in prison for the rest of their life when it wasn't a violent crime. So those three things really had an impact on me and troubled me while I was a federal prosecutor. But when you say, it's difficult to sort of understand and see what's happening around you and you're in the system, it's absolutely, you can't do it. It's almost impossible while you're in there.
There's a couple of good places we could jump off here, Brett. Let's talk a little bit about mandatory minimums. What was the reasoning behind why these were instituted in the first place? Mandatory minimum sentences for certain crimes, and what is your take on it as far as you mentioned the frustration with a punishment that seemed to far outweigh the actual crime committed? Is there likely reform ahead?
Yeah, it's great question. It's a packed question because, and what I mean is, you have to understand in the federal system where we've been, and real quickly, the 70s and 80s experienced crime escalating, but more important, I think, that would eventually be the cause of swinging the pendulum too far the other way would be outrage at a few federal sentences that occurred that seemed very inconsistent, didn't seem to punish enough. And so you had the creation of the sentencing guidelines that sought to make sure, using a formula and sort of, taking the discretion of judges out of the equation. And it really was because of the backlash that occurred from some sentences in the 70s. And then Congress kind of, legislators grabbed onto that wave of frustration that the country was facing, and said, "Oh, I know how I can do good to my constituents, and that's by being tough on crime." So then they started to pass what were referred to as mandatory minimums, and those sentences originally started somewhat modestly. You had a 5-year mandatory minimum, the drug area that was most common. You had a few others. You had a 2-year mandatory minimum. But between the late 80s and now, there has been an explosion in federal statutes as legislators decide that's the way they can get reelected and become popular. And they not only passed more, they also escalated the penalties. And I was actually working in Congress from 2003 to 2006 when several of the really high mandatory minimums were passed. And I can tell you, I sat in the room and listened to why those were being passed. They were being passed not based on data or analysis or anything like that. It was political. It was because the other side was going to have a tough time voting against those. And so they continued to pass them. And it's still there. That mentality is still there, despite the fact that the country has started to recognize that we are over-incarcerating and over-criminalizing, our experience here in the country.
And Brett, there's obviously many stories to be told to put a face on this over-criminalization and over-incarceration. Obviously, the statistics about how we incarcerate, more people per capita than like any country in the nation, and the story that comes to mind for me is one here in our backyard. I'm sure, of course, you're familiar with, and that is Weldon Angelos, who himself has become a criminal justice reformer because he was sentenced in federal court by Judge Cassell to 55 years in prison, more than people who could be raping other people and so forth. And his crime was he was caught selling some marijuana and apparently had a firearm that he didn't brandish or use, but he had it on him, and that triggered a mandatory minimum with stacked charges that cumulatively added up to 55 years. And interestingly, and I love your response to this as just one brief story we could touch on for this trend, Judge Cassell had his hands tied as a judge. He felt the sentence was unfair, and in sentencing basically said, this is wrong, this is unjust, only Congress can fix this. This is kind of ridiculous that I now have to sentence this guy to 55 years for selling pot. And among other things, that ruling, that opinion in the sentence is one thing that prompted now Senator Mike Lee to become a very strong advocate for criminal justice reform, recognizing, as you point out, Brett, how the pendulum has swung and how Congress is really out of step with this. What are your thoughts, maybe just briefly, about the Weldon Angelos case and that as kind of a little peek inside this system you're describing?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought Weldon's case up. I was the U.S. attorney when that case was sentenced. I was just after the U.S. attorney's office made the decision to go back to the grand jury and add additional charges that would eventually result in the 55-year sentence. I was powerless to change the outcome, but I'll give you just a couple interesting anecdotes about that case. It was incredibly troubling to many in the office, including myself. I remember having a conversation with the prosecutor about the line assistant U.S. attorney, so the prosecutor in charge of the case. And he said, well, I offered Weldon Angelos 15 years, and he didn't take it. And so it was in order to assert his rights I was talking to the prosecutor, trying to get a feel for why the case was going the way it was, why the sentence was going to be so long. And that was his reasoning, was that, he offered 15, and when he rejected that, I wouldn't say spite, I would just say that when you're a federal prosecutor, you are so used to having all power and authority that when you're so generous to give such a short sentence, 15 years, you're almost incensed that somebody would reject that. And so they went back to the grand jury and charged multiple charges. Now, the gun wasn't on him. It was in his vehicle. So there's even factual issues that just still, make you scratch your head, which is why Judge Paul Cassell, who is a friend of mine, called me after the sentence, after he issued the sentence and the scathing opinion about how frustrated he was, called me a few days after that and informed me that he was going to leave the bench, and that was one of the driving reasons.
Wow.
Was that he felt like he could be a better advocate. And that moment really caused me to think long and hard about, what was happening and these long sentences. I get people all the time, though, that say, hey, if you don't want to do the time, don't do the crime, or, people should be going to jail. And we have this mentality, but I will tell you that Weldon, and I interact with him, is a tremendous guy working very hard, trying to reform the system. It sounds, unthinkable that a prosecutor is going to interact with someone who is convicted of a federal crime, and yet he's the one that I think really took reform and the need to look at our criminal justice system to a higher level, at least on a federal level.
Well, and clearly born of personal experience. We should note for the listener who's not familiar with the story that Weldon, after 13 years, was released from prison, and now, as Brett is pointing out, is going around the country speaking and doing documentaries and really trying to be a face for reform. Brian.
I had a question for you, Brett, about the conviction rate in the federal courts. I don't have the exact statistics in front of me, but I feel pretty safe in saying last I heard it was above 96%, whether people took a plea deal or they actually were convicted, in a criminal trial. To what do you attribute that what seems like almost abnormally high success rate? Is it just a matter of time and resources available to federal prosecutors, or is there something more at play?
Yeah, I think it is. When I was U.S. Attorney, I think we calculated our conviction rate at something close to 99%, which is just staggering. And that the individuals that are pleading guilty, so not going to trial, not being judged by the jury of peers, just choosing to plead guilty, was about 95%. And so, most people look at that and they say, well, yeah, those are remarkable, but look, these are criminals you're going after. So of course they plead guilty, or they, are found guilty. And the big elephant in the room that nobody is talking about is that in the federal system, unlike in the state system, there's a couple of things that weigh so heavily that very few defendants can withstand that weight, and very few can go forward with trying to defend themselves. And that weight comes as a result of a few things. One, in the federal system, there are inordinately high sentences. Two, there's no parole, so you're going to serve virtually all of that sentence. And then the third issue is you are punished, meaning your sentence gets longer if you don't plead guilty. Mm-hmm. And it gets even longer if you go to trial. And it gets even longer if you take the stand and testify on your own defense. And people ask me all the time, how is that constitutional? And I tell them, it is remarkable that we have allowed this to become constitutional.
Yeah. You
cannot, in the federal system, go to trial, and you cannot take the stand. Because if you do, then your sentence, in a couple of instances, will double or triple based on, what crime. you're being accused of.
Brett, let me ask you this. We have this rosy notion, we Americans, that in the criminal justice system, an individual is presumed innocent until proven guilty in a court of law. And perhaps you're touching on it here with how plea deals kind of come into the issue and everything. But as a former prosecutor turned criminal justice reformer, what are your thoughts on that theory, that legal theory, that premonition we generally have about the presumption of innocence? Is there really any substantive validity to it? Do you feel that it's accurate? What are your thoughts on that popular refrain?
Yeah, I used to say when I was a brand new prosecutor that, the justice system attempts to be very fair, and that we'd rather 10 guilty men go free than one innocent be incarcerated. I'm here to tell you that was the biggest bunch of hogwash I probably have ever uttered. And why I say that, and sadly, is there is no presumption of innocence. From the time the indictment comes out, the press, releases, the attitude of the judges in the case, the interaction with the criminal justice system, the interaction in their communities, everything is guilty until proven innocent. It's the exact opposite. And I was a prosecutor and real aggressive, and I was winning all my cases. I thought I was such a great lawyer. And when I stopped being a federal prosecutor, I really found out what it was like to be a lawyer and to work hard and to get my butt kicked in court, and realized that the system itself and the rules under which it operates are so heavily weighted in favor of the prosecution that the notion of losing a case, or the notion of not convicting someone, is absolutely foreign. It's not in your experience as a federal prosecutor. You rarely ever lose even an argument because of some of those rules. And those rules that are in place absolutely contradict that notion of innocent until proven guilty.
Brett, final question for you that I'm going to preface with a bit of an awkward analogy maybe. I'm imagining, someone who's in a highly religious family. Let's say you're Catholic and you grow up Catholic and your whole family's Catholic, and one day you decide to change religions, right? You're going to become a Buddhist monk, right? And
Sure.
Your highly Catholic family looks at you as if, you're now an alien from a different planet. Maybe they disown you. They certainly don't understand why you would leave the family religion, the faith, and everything like that. And do you feel, as a former prosecutor turned criminal justice reformer, that there's any comparison there, where what I'm really asking is, as you have all these colleagues in the system, former coworkers, prosecutors, judges, and where now from the outside you see, as I understand it, with kind of more open eyes, many of these problems, as you try and talk to them about those issues, do you feel as if you're kind of preaching a different religion and they're just kind of walled off and, no, sorry, that's not my belief, I'm not listening? Or is that wrong, and you do find that maybe there is some sympathy and support and willingness to kind of consider what you're raising?
It's an interesting analogy. I think it does apply. I'll tell you that when I first started on this effort to reform the criminal justice system, I spent a lot of time almost defending my decision and defending, my positions with many of my colleagues who were in the Department of Justice. And then I also had experiences, and have continued to have experiences, with many of my colleagues who were in the Department of Justice and are now out. And an interesting sort of informal and unsophisticated polling occurred by me with, my former colleagues. And almost to a person, if they were in the Department of Justice, they treated me as though I had left the fold and had fallen from grace and no longer could see the light. But to all those colleagues of mine who had been former federal prosecutors or former U.S. attorneys or former police officers, almost every single one of them, we were in agreement that the system needed changes. And so I find that fascinating that, it goes back to what you said at the beginning, but when they're in the department, they can't see the effort, and it's why it's so difficult to reform the system, because they dig in very deeply trying to defend all the authority and power that they've grown accustomed to. But then those that are out and those that reflect on it start to see that there are areas that there can be an improvement. And just last, I'll say, I have found that folks that believe that reform is about, not prosecuting or not putting people in jail or not being tough on crime, actually don't understand reform. I want the individual like Weldon Angelo's, who's dealing marijuana and has a gun to protect himself and is probably affecting the lives of many through addiction or whatever. I want them to be prosecuted and punished and serve their time. But 95% of everyone that we prosecute gets out eventually. And what we're finding is you're arresting people. It's a revolving door. And we're doing it at $30,000 to $40,000 per person per year to taxpayers, costing taxpayers. And so the reflection that I've had and the why it's passionate for me now is because I am fully convinced that we are still of the same fold and still the same, by your analogy, of the same beliefs. And that is that we want to root out crime, but the lack of vision of those inside the department and the inability to actually look at themselves and reform the system from within prevents them from seeing that we don't have to lock Weldon Angelos up for 50 years in order to properly punish and in order to rehabilitate. 1 year could have been enough. 2 years, 5 years could have been enough. In this instance, it was 13 years that he served as he got out in an extraordinary national effort to help him get out. Mm-hmm. And he's fully rehabilitated in terms of everything that he does, and his family appreciates it. But if nothing would have happened, we would have spent $30,000 to $40,000 per year for 50 years to incarcerate an individual who could have learned his lesson, paid his debt to society, and been rehabilitated in a fraction of the time.
The story is all the more interesting when you have, at the time we're recording this, just yesterday, Canada fully legalizing recreational marijuana, and then Justin Trudeau working to exonerate all the past convicts. So very, very interesting indeed when you talk about, are we just warehousing individuals, or are we trying to rehabilitate them in the truest sense of the word and incentivize and encourage good behavior as you reintegrate into society? So obviously topics for another day. Voices like yours, sure. Brett, in our opinion, I think are crucial, because many of us can come in from the sidelines and with our opinions, but when you have people who convert to the faith, if you were, and come from that kind of experience inside the system, much more insightful and interesting and appreciated to kind of see that people can have a change of heart and then bring that experience to bear in trying to bring change to the system. So Brett Tolman, former U.S. attorney, now a compadre in the fight for criminal justice reform. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Society and the State. For show notes, archives, and more great content, visit societyandthestate.com.